Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today for the Fueling Collaboration Panel Discussion Series, Discussion 3. My name is Lindsay Hosier, and I'm the coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, and it is my pleasure to be opening today's discussion. Before we get started, we will launch a quick poll to get a sense of who is joining us today. And Eric, will you launch our poll? Thank you. And we have three questions that we hope everyone will answer. Question 1 is what best describes your work? Question 2, where are you physically located? And question 3, how did you hear about today's webinar? Awesome. Thanks, everybody. A lot of resource and land managers, fire practitioners, communications, researchers. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll keep it open for another 10 seconds or so. All right, Eric, if you want to go ahead and close our poll. Awesome. So it looks like we have a lot of land and natural resource managers with us today, a handful of practitioners, researchers. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for answering that poll. We really do use that information. And we do have some quick housekeeping to get through before we kick off today's discussion. The Fueling Collaboration Panel Discussion Series is presented by the Joint Fire Science Program Fire Science Exchange Networks in the Eastern United States, all of whom you can see here on your screen. And the goals of Fueling Collaboration are to bring together researchers and managers to learn about and discuss the latest in fire science and to build collective learning and collaborative opportunities across the region. And this is our third discussion of season 6. Our next and final discussion will be held on February 19th, and that is reframing the ecology of fire in eastern United States old growth forest ecosystems. And if this is your first time participating, all of our discussions do follow a similar format, which is a group discussion with minimal PowerPoint presentation slides. We will have a few PowerPoint slides just to set the stage for today's discussion. This discussion is built upon questions that were submitted in advance, so thank you to anyone who did submit any questions. Participants will be muted and video will be turned off during the discussion. However, the chat box is open. We do encourage active participation in the chat box. We simply ask that messages stay on point with the discussion and be respectful and inclusive of differing opinions. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording on the Fueling Collaboration website as well as the Fueling Collaboration YouTube channel. And closed captioning is available. You can access this at the bottom of your screen where it says CC. If you click on that, that will engage the live captioning. And lastly, this discussion is approved for 1.5 Category 1 CFEs by the Society of American Foresters, which we will be using the participant list to submit to SAF. Please check that your name is spelled correctly on your screen. If it is not spelled correctly, click the 3 dots next to your name and select Rename. And in order to receive the credits, you must participate for the entire discussion and complete the online attendance form spreadsheet that will be shared in the chat box towards the end of the discussion. Within 2 weeks, you will be emailed a certificate of attendance from Polly of the Forest Stewards Guild. And if you have any questions, we will be dropping Polly's email into the chat box. Today's discussion will dive into the complex, let me make sure that's not showing on my screen. There we go. Relationship between hurricanes and wildland fire. Our panelists will share insights in how these events affect prescribed fire planning and post-firestorm behavior in ecosystems. Our panelists include Brian Capasano, and he is the Assistant Chief of Forest Management for the Florida Forest Service and oversees timber management, recreation management, planning, restoration, and ecological programs. Brian Rogers is with the North Carolina Forest Service and is currently the regional ranger. He has expertise in wildland fire operations. Jeff Cannon is a landscape ecologist at the Jones Center Icaway. He studies the ecology of forest disturbance and restoration in pine ecosystems. And Steve Norman is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. His research develops practical ways to map and interpret forest impacts from fire. And our moderator today is Brett Williams, and he is the Technology Transfer Specialist and Liaison to the Southern Research Station for the Southern region of the U.S. Forest Service in Aviation Management. And before I pass it over to Brett to kick off this discussion, I would like to first acknowledge all of our organizers and planning team, all of whom you can see here on the screen. They're an absolute amazing team, and I am so proud to be able to work alongside them. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to contact any of these organizers. And with that, Brett, I will pass it over to you to kick off the discussion. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Lindsay. And thanks to all the Eastern Area Fire Science Exchanges for hosting this today and asking all of us panelists and facilitators to join in. My name is Brett Williams. I'm a technology transfer specialist with the southern region of the U.S. Forest Service Fire and Aviation Management. And I also, like Lindsay said, liaison to the Southern Research Station. I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar. And I'm going to queue up a slide or two just to bring things to life here. So yeah, prior to my position with the Forest Service, I was a fire ecologist and then FMO for Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, Hurlburt Field Special Operations Command, and Moody Air Force Base in Georgia. And in 2018, I'm going to go into this a little deeper after we get through introductions, but Hurricane Michael made a direct hit on Tyndall Air Force Base in 2018 as a Cat 5. So it overnight went from working forest, mature slash pine longleaf forest to basically a high graded forest, everything over 8 inches in diameter. So went on the ground, and the smaller diameter trees were like whips, and they slowly fell out over time. A few may still be remaining, but cleared 60 miles of fire line. The crew that I had there, shout out to Anthony DiMaggio, that was my AFMO there, but their crew cleared 60 miles of fire line with excavators, skid steers, saws, and got back on the horse and started burning the next year. A couple of those aerial ignition burns you can see there. And so that gave me a unique perspective in kind of picking up the pieces post storm. And then after Hurricane Helene in 2024, I was part of the Fire and Aviation Management Forest Service regional team that helped kind of assess the storm damage from a fire perspective, both wildfire, prescribed fire, what's going to be the constraints and challenges moving forward, and help provide decision support during one of the most active wildfire seasons in the Southern Apps in early 2025. So I'm hoping those experiences inform today's discussion. And that, I think I'll go ahead and pass it to Jeff Cannon.
Jeff, I think you're muted.
You may try somebody else, maybe Lindsay, maybe circle back.
Yeah, maybe circle back to Jeff.
Okay. How about Steve Norman?
So, as was said, I'm a research ecologist here at the Southern Research Station. And I'm originally from rural Pennsylvania, and one way or another, I've been studying fire ecology, landscape ecology, landscape risks across the U.S., East and West Coast since about 1995 during my graduate school days. Been in the South since 2007 with the Eastern Threat Assessment Center. And my primary job is to understand forest disturbance to improve our monitoring so that forest managers and planners can ultimately make better decisions. And I'm pretty familiar with the 2016-17 wildfire season we had in the Southern Alps, as well as Hurricane Wind, because I experienced it both uh, very directly. And I've done a lot of research on those two events in particular. I'm a little familiar with the coastal plain, but my real expertise is up here in the homes.
Hey, thanks, Steve. How about Brian Campesano?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Campisano. I'm the Assistant Chief of Forest Management for the Florida Forest Service. Um, I'm born and raised in Florida. I grew up in Southwest Florida and spent time throughout the entire state. I've lived through many hurricanes. The first one I remember as a kid was Hurricane Andrew, and of course, we've had plenty of them up this way since I've been in my professional career with the Florida Forest Service, and had to work through a lot of the challenges associated with being impacted by, in some cases, severe hurricanes. A little background on me: I have a bachelor's and a master's, both from the University of Florida in wildlife ecology, then in general ecology. And I began working for the Florida Forest Service as an OPS biologist back in 2007. In 2010, I took a position as the district biologist over in our Jacksonville district, where I did a lot of burning and got certified as a firefighter, and did a lot of the boots on the ground time. 2014, I came up to the state office as our state ecologist and did a lot more with the ecological impacts of things. But now, since 2019, I've been the assistant chief of forest management, which kind of puts me over all of the programs that we have on our state forests and all of the things that come along with keeping people safe during hurricanes and having to do closures. And my God, it was nice to have a season this year where we didn't have to close anything for any tropical storms. So that was nice. I have a background as addition to the forestry tasks that I do. I'm trained as a fire behavior analyst. I mean, full disclosure, my qualification task book is still not quite complete. That's been a challenge in my current position to get that finished up. But I've been teaching fire behavior classes specifically for the Florida Forest Service, usually S390, and others as they come up. And I look for opportunities like this to share knowledge and really kind of further my realm of understanding and help others understand situations better as well. So thank you, and Brett, back to you.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I see Jeff's back. Or Jeff, you want to give it a try now? Jeff Cannon?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jeff Cannon. I'm a landscape ecologist at the Jones Center at Itchaway in Southwest Georgia. Sorry for the technical issues earlier. I had some slides to share, but I'll avoid that in case that was part of the issue. But for the last about 15 years, I've been studying different aspects of forest disturbances, tornadoes, wildfire, and since 2018, Hurricane Michael, which impacted Southwest Georgia, has presented a lot of opportunities to study the impacts of hurricanes. So our lab really emphasizes that. Unlike the managers here, I don't do a lot with managing post-fire landscapes, but we have done some research on that, and there's really interesting the huge amount of changes that occur in the fieldscape besides just all the downed trees. And there's also a lot of cascading ecological effects on wildlife and plants, and we've also been studying some mitigation tactics. How can you manage a forest in a manner that will make it more resistant to hurricanes? So I'm happy to talk about some of that as the questions come up. So thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that. Glad the IT was working. And last but not least, Brian Rogers.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Rogers. I'm the regional ranger for the North Carolina Forest Service. So my coverage area is the western third, basically everywhere from the city of Monroe to Murphy. So it's the western 32 counties. Help coordinate fire suppression, fire training. That's my day-to-day role. And I've been with the agency for going on 20 years. So we've experienced hurricanes, or dry years with fire suppression through Western North Carolina. And as far as Hurricane Helene, the most recent, functioned as the IC on our Type 3 team, coordinating chainsaw task forces, moving resources around, supporting the county's emergency management through getting roads opened back up and continue that through the spring fire season last year with some of our larger fire responses that we had uh, within the region. So hopefully I can offer some information, a little background, and also learn a little bit today. So I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion.
Hey, appreciate it, Brian. Glad you're here. I'm going to go ahead and share screen real quick. Wanna, there we go. Okay, so yeah, just want to tee up the discussion today, or frame the discussion is a better way to put it. So really excited to have you all on today because two of the bigger hurricanes in recent past caused the most damage. Hurricane Michael was more coastal plain, kind of southern Piedmont impacts. Helene, while it did cause a lot of impacts in Florida and South Georgia and up into South Carolina, just the scale and intensity and kind of rarity of the impacts in Western North Carolina and the Southern Apps, not just North Carolina, but the Southern Apps, kind of gives us two geographies to examine here and the expertise. We have oh, oh, folks that are in Florida, like Brian Camposano, and then folks in Western North Carolina, like Brian Rogers, Jeff Cannon along the coastal plain, and Steve Norman, master of all, maybe. But anyway, hoping to frame the discussion with kind of those two geographies. So first, want to look at Hurricane Helene. Most of you probably saw it on the news or were directly impacted by it, but landfall in September of 2024, sustained wind speeds of 140 miles an hour. And those that have seen the aftermath know fuel beds, forest structure significantly altered. That's probably an understatement. Heavy amount of down debris, increased risk of wildfire, attempts to salvage as much as possible off the landscape where it was feasible due to slope and access and so forth. Just providing access was a big issue, opening roads and bridges and so forth. Um, yeah, and then the impacts didn't stop at the coast. It was all the way. They were getting 100-mile-an-hour winds all the way up into Georgia, North Carolina, and cut paths across 9 national forests, some more than others from Florida to Kentucky. And you can see almost $80 billion worth of damage there. And I would give a shout out to Steve Norman on this one. This map you're seeing is a combined product of one of Steve Norman's remote sensing change detection products, and then the U.S. Forest Service GTAG Delta Viewer. And then to kind of the other bookmark on this, maybe out of order because this happened in 2018, but Hurricane Michael, Cat 5 storm, like I was talking about, made landfall at Tyndall Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle. Max sustained winds of 155 miles an hour. Um, just a, it was a really small, like tight storm, kind of diameter wise, but it just really wreaked a path of havoc up through North Florida, South Georgia. Yeah, those were in parts of Alabama. Um, and then again, just post hurricane down woody debris. Luckily, the terrain down there is flat. That's an advantage, and folks are used to hurricanes down on the Gulf Coast. But still, $31 billion worth of damage. So we're going to kind of use those two geographies and those two disturbance events, storms, to frame today's discussion. And if I can stop sharing screen here, there we go. So we'll launch right into it, and we're going to cover a range of topics today. We're going to let the conversation flow a little freely, but we'll be looking at everything from kind of post-storm, how to pick up the pieces on RX, uh, implications for wildfire response and safety, changes to the fuel scape, like Jeff mentioned, some tools for managers that we're beginning to develop as a community, a little bit about smoke and air quality, preparedness, WUI considerations, and ecological effects. So we'll see where the conversation goes, y'all. But that's for the audience, kind of where we're going. So let's start. Well, a lot of interest from the questions that came into this webinar on prescribed fire. What do? You went from either some you had a functional burn program, you were getting fire on the ground, or maybe you weren't, or maybe you were thinking about getting fire on the ground, but all of a sudden overnight you've got a different fuel scape and a lot of change there. So maybe I'll start with Jeff Cannon. What are some changes in fuels that can occur following a major storm event?
Yeah, thanks. So the major ones and the most obvious ones that we'll see are the huge increase in coarse woody debris. That's kind of obvious, but there's a lot more subtle changes that can create a lot of complexity, and those who've dealt with it probably know this really well. But even though there's this really large increase in coarse woody debris, not all of that is available in a lot of the lower intensity prescribed fires that many of us are doing. So a lot of times those 100-hour, 1,000-hour fuels, depending on the moisture and the weather, may really not come into play so much in terms of being so your assumption that you're automatically going to see a really intense fire may not be the case, although it's certainly possible in many circumstances. But what we found from some research kind of monitoring changes in fuels after some experimental hurricanes where we winched down trees, we kind of had some other research objectives, which is why we did it that way. But we did monitor fuels, and one thing that was surprising to me is when we looked at just the available fuels, the fuels that were typically consumed in a prescribed fire, most of those really didn't change that much. We saw increases in grasses. So with that large open canopy, you can get a glut of new grasses. But you also get a big decrease in litter input. So in forest ecosystems where leaf litter is a major component of fuel, you may not get all that distributed throughout the stand all year. Instead, it's all deposited in one spot all in one day. And so what that creates are, in some areas, you have really intense fire behavior, especially concentrated in down tree crowns where there's a high concentration of fuels. And then just outside of that, you actually typically have slightly lower fine fuels. And so it's a little bit more complex than just lots and lots of fuel on the ground that can create a lot of challenges. But like I said, and all that's dependent on weather. But the kind of automatic assumption that everything's going to be intense and dangerous may not be the case. In fact, it can be some of those down fuels can be barriers if they're retaining moisture and things like that.
Oh, that's great. And you brought out kind of the both the immediate structural changes as well as touched on some of the temporal changes over time, or at least availability early on versus potentially later. And Steve Norman, I don't know if you have anything to add on this from your perspective, kind of big picture, either kind of adding on to what Jeff said about changes to the fuels, maybe immediately, and then how you think of that temporally over time.
I think that's a very important point that, I mean, I'm sure people that have experienced it repeatedly in the coastal plain have a good grasp of this, but one of the first things that I remember in the 6, 8 months afterwards is all the discussion people had and all the insight people had as the fires were starting to burn as to how the different fuel components were behaving in the first 6, 8 months. Spring 2025 fire season, it was pretty notable because it was dry and we had some big fires up here after Helene. And the large wood component, as Jeff said, it's like all the reports were saying that's actually not only not being engaged yet, the bark's on trees, the trees are still green. Quite often when they're on the ground, they're acting as barriers to fire spread, which is quite fascinating. Now, Hurricane Helene happened in the end of September. And so we had oak trees fall, canopy lowered. Those leaves are still in the trees. And so oak leaves always are retained a little bit longer. The process of leaf decision is always later than with other species, maybe beech, but the fall hadn't been realized chemically for the abscission of leaves. And so those darn leaves on the oak trees, they persisted well into spring and even into summer. In some places, you can probably still see them even now because they go through that normal shutdown process. And that creates canopy fueled oak leaves that can act as fuel ladders and increase spotting. And that was reported from several of our fires. And so even though we have logs that are down, we have all the normal leaves that first winter from the canopy, which is now partly dead. but we have more spotting and we have more sunlight that comes in, so everything can dry. Even the duck could theoretically be drier. And then very quickly in the summer, as the summer 2025 progressed, we had all this early successional fuel come in, this herbaceous growth because it was such a wet summer. And so when we think about fire hazard now in the fall, well, it's got that added component, and you add a few more seasons, and that bark's going to come off, and the wood will be able to be more, the coarse wood will be able to be more engaged. So it's complex and it evolves, and I think that just needs to really be thought through, because it means that in practice they're going to burn or suppress a fire. You've got to be aware of how the changes are evolving so quickly one fire season to the next.
Really appreciate that. And you mentioned something about spotting that caught my ear. What was the causal factor, or was there a primary causal factor that led to increased spotting in your mind?
Well, this is not from direct observation on my part, but from what I've heard, there's the leaves that are close to the canopy, right? It's falling down, it's close to the surface, and so it provides a fire ladder, which can increase the spotting. And what's interesting is we also had reports of the hemlock snags from 10, 15 years ago, suddenly creating spotting. And they didn't do that in 2016 very often, but now in recent fires, they've been doing that. And so you think, well, we have all these snags standing now, and they're going to be there. How many years is it going to take for these to become ember producers? It's something to think about in the next, half decade or decade. It's not that you're not going to go away in many places.
Yeah, that's a good point. So kind of bring it to the manager's perspective here, thinking about prescribed fire. What are some of the limitations or constraints or challenges to prescribed fire implementation? Maybe we can start in Florida with Brian C.
Okay, there we go. I had a trouble clicking off the mute button. So Michael was kind of the first big, there was a big unknown there, right? So what made that unique in the state of Florida specifically was where it went. We've had strong hurricanes, as strong as Michael, but it went through we'll call it the timber breadbasket of Florida, where you just have the most pine forests in the state, because let's face it, the rest of the peninsula is pretty well developed in a lot of places at this point. So our leadership at the time, and this is back when I was still in my ecologist role, they made some decisions based on the unknowns of how to re-implement prescribed burning across the impact area. And what they did was they broke it out into two zones. One was the primary impact zone, and then there was a secondary impact zone that was further to the east, and that had more of the maybe moderate to minimal damage, whereas the primary impact zone had all the catastrophic and severe damage as it was categorized by our agency. And they had checkpoints that they were going to allow certain activities until certain points, reevaluate, and then open things back up further. So there was a lot of debris on the ground, and we've heard it already, access. You can't burn anything well without good access, so you can maintain control over that. When you have, bowls of trees going every which way, twisted up into knots throughout your forested area, I mean, that is a problem. So the first thing was really let's authorize some certified pile burning, and then there's going to be no broadcast burning to start. So from the time the storm hit till about the 7th of January 2019, no broadcast burning was authorized. We wanted people to be burning off, in piles or going to disaster debris management sites, some of which required the use of an air curtain incinerator. Some were just not suitable for burning. But we had to get rid of that debris first. So that was a big factor. Once that date hit, and they went into phase 2. So that was 1/8 of 2019 through June 30th of 2019, where they started to open certified burning back up in the primary zone, and they allowed non-certified broadcast in the primary zone with director's office approval. And all the time with the secondary zone was always given a little bit more grace. So in that phase one, they could do a certified and non-certified, pile and broadcast burn. So it was just a slow chipping away through January 7th of 2020, when everything was kind of opened back up again for burning, because we recognized that some people were able to clear quickly, some not, but we couldn't hold up the process further to allow that, because we have to keep burning to manage our forests. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but an experience that happened about 5 years post-storm in March of 2022 was really eye-opening in terms of how long it can take before you start to see the true effects of hurricane fuels and how complicated they can be, especially in swamps. So I'll kick it back to y'all for now.
Yeah, let's definitely circle back to that, because that was a personal event to me too, that we can talk about when we get to wildfire. But Brian R., from your perspective, I don't know if folks are starting to. I know there was some burning this past kind of late spring, or maybe it was more this fall in the southern Apps and western North Carolina. But maybe you can talk to both. What you're thinking about from North Carolina Forest Service point of view on oh, opening or burning back up, and what you might recommend to managers as they approach that oh, process.
Yep. You know, it's going to be on a case by case basis. You know, with the complexity of variety of aspects and fuels and elevation, you know, some tracks can still be feasibly burned, and then others are going to have to be looked at a little bit harder. You know, one of the challenges that we're going to face here in the area, is traditionally, natural features were used as fire lines, those creeks, streams, and now with the debris that's been deposited, a lot of those creeks and streams are not going to be, suitable holding features, without extensive amount of work. There's a lot of jackpots of fuel, from that's been deposited from the flooding aspect of Helene, and so each track's going to have to really be looked at hard, making sure that if you are going to use those natural features for fire breaks, that they are going to hold. During wildfire suppression back last spring, if you didn't have personnel in there actively holding, prepping, and doing considerable amount of work to those stream beds, they were not going to hold, and that's been pretty traditional fire break for people that's burning here in Western North Carolina. So it's going to take a lot more extensive prep work and really evaluating each site in particular to be able to bring back that successful burn program.
Yep, slow and steady. So, and before we leave this topic, I've got some thoughts too. But anyone else from the group want to kind of speak to post-storm challenges, or more recommendations you would give managers, considerations, kind of thinking less about agency and kind of how you, as an agency, open up burning again and evaluate that. But like, let's say just a private landowner wants to, and we can maybe talk about Southern Apps and Coastal Plain, but maybe we'll start Coastal Plain. What you might recommend to managers, or Brian C., if y'all put out any guidance as far as fuel break, widening fuel breaks, or how soon after the storm you should consider burning once we let you, and then do you need more crew? Do you need aviation assets to have eyes in the sky? Those sorts of things. I don't know if you could speak to that at all, Brian C.
So, I would encourage people to get fire back onto the landscape, to restart burning as soon as it's safe to do so. You've got access to your site, you have good lines or boundaries to act as fire breaks. The fuel load, I think it was said earlier, the fuel load is not all available right away, right? So there is something to chipping away as soon as possible. You're going to have a more open canopy in areas where there's heavy damage. That's going to allow drying of fuels and things like that, or your finer fuels to happen more rapidly. But at the end of the day, you want to chip away at some of those larger diameter fuels if you're not able to get them cleared off your property, or some other way of getting rid of that fuel slowly but surely. Hit them while they still have fuel moisture, hit them while they're still not quite all the way cured or rotten, because as that happens, it's just going to become more challenging if you have not taken any of that biomass away through repeated prescribed burns. I put it in the comment in the chat. I mean, once we as a state reopened, we didn't really see a whole lot of, I'm not going to say there were no problems, but there weren't any massive problems with prescribed burning for the most part, because people understood the responsibility involved in putting fire on the landscape, and just how different the landscape looked in some cases. And it really, some folks were able to actually get contractors on to actually remove some of the heaviest debris so they could more quickly, safely put fire back on the landscape, but not everybody could afford to do that. And of course, you had a hyper concentration of all this timber damage in an area that you're competing for shared resources. And that was a problem too. I mean, people trying to get wood moved out of the area, salvage wood. I mean, you were lucky if you could get a salvage contract, because there was just such a high volume of wood on the ground. So if you can't get rid of that through any way other than burning, I would highly suggest you start to chip away soon, but you got to make sure it's safe to do so. We do have the, I guess, benefit, if you want to call it that, in Florida, that we are pretty flat. So we don't have the terrain and topography aspect as much to deal with. But that doesn't change anything as far as, making sure your site's accessible. You've got good blinds around it, and your fire is not going to just blow up. You might have to alter your firing techniques a little bit to either make it go through some of that heavier stuff while it's still got some moisture in it. But if you wait, that's when you're going to have problems.
Brian R., you feel or do you agree with a lot of that for the Southern Apps, or anything kind of local to there you might add?
You talking to Brian R. or Brian
Yeah,
C?
Brian R. Sorry if that didn't come through.
Yeah, one of our limiting factors, in removing a lot of this dead and down wood is that our pulpwood market, with the closures of a lot of the mills here recently, we just don't have that outlet, to be able to market that damaged, storm damaged wood. So that is definitely a factor. We're still, encouraging people to reach out to try to get some of this wood moved. But, that's definitely a hurdle that folks are having to overcome, is our pulpwood market a few years ago, took that downward turn. So, there is a large expense to the landowners, and we're trying to work on options to help offset that, and to cost share, and to help folks out. But there's limited amount of commercial markets, and the loggers, they can pick and choose on tracks. There's plenty of wood available, and so a lot of these harder to reach, harder to access areas just aren't getting the fuel removed commercially right now.
Yeah, it's a combination of just inaccessible due to lack of roads or slope or topography, but also lack of markets. So it's like a double whammy. Sounds like seeing some questions in the chat kind of related to this. Anyone have experience with air curtain incinerators, and whether that's I guess the question there is maybe scale, but if that's been effective as a post-storm debris removal strategy, or I guess technique. I don't know, Brian C., if you're familiar, or Brian R., if you.
I mean, I know they were used post Michael in quite a few places, and they were required to be used in some places to deal with the air quality. But I personally haven't had too much interaction with air curtains. I know there were some sites that you brought it to that you just see the air curtains brought to the sites, left there. It's going to be used on that site to help get rid of things. Didn't they have an air curtain at Tyndall?
They they may have at one point. They had a big chipping operation. There was a huge chipping operation at Tyndall, and then after that, the Air Force paid to haul the rest of it off. I don't know where it went, but I don't remember a lot of long-term air current incinerator on site there. But yeah, so if you can salvage log or salvage, that's probably your best bet, unless you're overly concerned about ground cover, or if you're more like a nature conservancy, you may want to just use fire. But when I was at Tyndall, I was like, take as much as you can get, and that'll help my job. A few things operationally I remember thinking about is just in heavy damaged areas, how are you going to even walk through the woods with a drip torch or ask somebody to do that safely? It's almost like a no-go on walking through the woods. So we were looking at a lot at aerial burns. At the time it was helo, but I think with UAS technology, that could be a huge benefit. We did a lot of kind of tabletop exercises, the what ifs. What if it jumps into this other area of heavy damage? What then? And kind of going big box if it does, because we're not putting dozers in there. We double up on, triple up on dozers if we had them, and try to get heavy dozers, because medium dozers and one dozer is not going to do it. And then if you are doing helo ops and aircraft, what if the ship goes down? And how are you going to get into oh yeah, save the crew, or at least help that emergency situation. So we shared in the resources on the fueling collaboration page. There's a lot more detail and bullet lists of sort of these considerations. I don't know. I'll open up to Jeff and Steve. Do you want to add anything? What fire managers should be thinking about post storm in terms of RX implementation? No, it's a topic we could think all day, but talk all day. But yeah, Jeff.
One extra thing to add on the salvage logging, I come from an ecological perspective, and I often had to push back a little bit on the urge to clean up the forest after these hurricanes, and remembrance that these are very natural disturbances that have been occurring for millennia. A lot of our species are adapted to it, and so I mean, your primary concern and your primary ecological management tool is fire. So to the extent that this down debris is limiting your ability to burn, absolutely, it's pretty imperative to reduce that so you can burn operationally. But also don't fret if you can't remove it from every acre, because we've been doing some research on what is actually utilizing that down wood after a hurricane, and found in one study we found that about 50 different vertebrate species really descend on those down trees, the tip up mounds. So there's from the resin that's released from the pine seems to attract lots of insects, and then so this is a pretty important kind of oasis for a lot of different vertebrates. And this was in longleaf basking, and even there was an ecological cascade. First, a lot of insectivorous animals, and then later more herbivores would move in. So just to add that counterpoint, but of course, removing the fuel is important to the extent that you must get back in with prescribed fire. That's primary, but also don't forget that there are plenty of critters that use that downwood as well.
Good point, Jeff. I think I should have said it from the outset, but these just large scale storm disturbances have shaped the ecology of the southern region. We'll get back into that, I hope, at the closer to the end. But yeah, this is what shaped our forest, or this disturbance regime, as much as fire in some ways, or fire and hurricanes. So there's finding that balance between risk management, salvage logging to be able to keep burning, reduce the risk, but realizing these are important ecological effects too. And Steve, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with much of what Jeff said. We have reason to think from an ecological perspective that hurricanes have been going on for a long time, and dead trees are part of the system. What is a major nuance to that, though, in the mountains up here, is the extent of the patch sizes. And looking back in history and in the tree ring record, we don't really see evidence of extremely large blowdown patches here in the mountain, going back at least, probably 1800, at least to the Civil War time frame. Almost no evidence of this. Did it ever happen? Well, it's a lot of it's chance. So you take 1,000 years out once in a while, for sure. Somewhere, different places, nuances. You look at our big hurricanes like Hugo in 1989. It didn't really come that much into the mountains. You had Camille in 69. And different places can see impacts, but boy, this was a big deal. And the previous insight we had was from Hurricane Opal in 1996, I believe. And the sort of large patches we were talking about were like just a few dozen acres. And depending on how you're going to define the patch, you could say we have tens of thousands acre sized patches on some places northeast of Asheville. It's the sort of effects that we saw on the coast with Hurricane Michael, but so far inland. And so, and the reality is, we have a lot of demands from our forest now. So what are you going to do with all this wood? We're not going to take it away for the most part because we don't have any capacity to do that. We're like a year and a half in very soon. On mills, we're not able to do that. So how do you get rid of wood? 3 ways, right? It's taken out, it's consumed by fire, prescribed fire, wildfire, or it decays. And an aspect of it that I don't think we understand very well is how we might be able to accelerate decay. We know how we can engage fire. We know how we can engage salvage logging or removal. Can we accelerate decay in some of these places? And the small landowners who have no way to reduce their fuel risk are wondering about that a great deal. What can I do?
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I can think of that really could be efficient and effective is to get it on the ground a little quickly. Prescribed fire can help do that, but there's also mechanical ways to just go through there, through your forest, and maybe cut down the duration of large wood by half. Instead of 20 years from now, you're very worried about it. Maybe you can accelerate it to just maybe 10 years. For instance, it depends on the species, it depends on the site, and a lot of other factors. We need to think, I think we need to think about that a little bit more as an option. And what I mean, what you're doing is, doesn't get rid of that short-term smoldering fire risk, but it can reduce how many years you might have to have an elevated risk for a particular small woodlot below your home.
Yeah. Yeah, so I did appreciate that, Steve, and from everybody. And I saw in the chat about the impacts of from Kyle Shepard, impacts of reduced needle cast on ground post hurricane, and it just made me think of what Brian C said was get in as early as possible if you can, use the fuel moisture to your advantage or the lack of decay to your advantage on the heavy fuels. That was the approach we took at Tyndall, and it immediately gives you wildfire risk reduction because you're removing all that fine fuels if you're successful. But then as an RX manager, I was like, well, I don't have any overstory anymore. I don't have any fine litter inputs. What is my return interval going to go to 5 or 6 years instead of 2 to 3 just because I can't get fire to propagate through the stand without a fine litter input. So you get that big dump of fine litter. I can't remember if it was Jeff, maybe, or Steve that was talking about that. But then how do you build up your fire regime or your fine litter, I guess, over time or maintain it? And I don't know if anybody has any insight on that, but just something I'd mention is kind of as you're thinking through this stuff, there's risk reduction. There's also balancing ecological versus the risk reduction, but that fine fuel regime and continuity over time is I think something we'll learn more about as we keep studying this stuff. In the interest of time, I thought we'd move on to some wildfire response considerations. So yeah, so what could be done in advance to help mitigate the negative impacts of storms like this? So anything we can do to get ahead of this, and maybe I'll start with Brian Rogers. Anything y'all? I mean, I guess this came out of left field, like Steve said. Helene came. It was a rare event. I don't know. Were you even thinking about hurricanes in the Southern Alps and how it might affect fire management previous to this?
Yeah, not on this scale, but we are promoting mitigation right now, working on getting, especially in that home ignition zone, getting that defensible space and that 50 to 100 feet around structures. We ran into that a lot this past spring. Some the homes that have kind of cleaned up the debris around it, we were able to get in, get that defensible space and get move on to the next one pretty quick. But a lot of these houses, especially vacation homes, secondary homes where someone doesn't live there year round, still had considerable amount of debris piled up within 20 to 30 feet, and you know, so if we can get out ahead of that, get that defensible space built back around structures, look at opening up existing logging roads. We've most everywhere has logging roads in the southern Appalachians, and if we can get those back open to be able to use for fuel breaks, for either prescribed fire or for wildfire suppression, that's going to get us ahead. When we get on a fire, has logging roads, but they're packed with blowdown. We have to really evaluate if that's something that we have time to open back up on the fly, or if we're going to need to back up and find a more suitable road to use. So prioritizing home ignition zones, prioritizing opening up those access from logging roads back into the forest again is where we need to just to put our efforts at right now.
Yeah, you're never going to get all the logs off the ground across the whole disturbance area, so you're prioritizing those home ignition zones and defensible space. And is there anything go to Jeff Cannon that we can do to manage the forest to mitigate the effects of storms?
Yeah. So when you think about what makes a forest sensitive to wind, I mean, you've got a lot of the landscape factors like, drier soils can promote a lot more root development and things like that. But in terms of things that you can control, some of the research we've done recently on planted pine might be useful to think about. We've done some comparisons. There are really big differences in species vulnerability to wind. Some are far more wind firm than others. When you get into category 3, 4, or 5, maybe some of those differences don't matter so much. But in the lighter winds and chronic winds that we see, some of the most important traits are deep roots, smaller crowns, shorter trees, and then higher taper. So to the extent that management can increase those properties, so switching to less vulnerable species. So among southern pines, longleaf pine, hands down, has a lot less wind susceptibility than some of the other species of pine, slash pine, and loblolly that we've compared to. Some of those discrepancies start to disappear on drier soils where the rooting properties are a little bit more similar. But as you get into wetter soils, those rankings can be pretty different. I don't have as much experience in the southern Apps since we've been talking about Helene, but to the extent that you can get sort of smaller crown, deeper rooted species, some of the species that like drier soils, and then outside of planted stands, burning to promote those, which I think would be compatible with a lot of the restoration that's happening in those areas. So yeah, we did a little bit of research on longleaf pine stands that were impacted by Hurricane Michael, and found that stands that had a lot more taper, higher diameter to height ratio. So opening, managing more open stands where you get more diameter growth for a given height seemed to make a pretty big difference. Other things for management are nearby cover. So, how much forest is upwind can matter a lot. So, reducing the amount of fragmentation can be a pretty useful technique. And we found that not just in pine, but also in pecan orchards, which we've started to look at. So, just managing for more resistant species, managing for taper, and then thinking about the landscape and reducing fragmentation are things that you can do to mitigate the initial effects so you don't have to deal with some of these problems that we've been talking about.
I appreciate that. Kind of going to change gears a little bit, still talking about wildfire, but in terms of response and safety, post storm, I'll open it up to Brian C. or Brian R. What were you doing what changed as far as like how you were briefing your responders, and what were some of the considerations that you were having to take that you never took pre-storm, I guess. And maybe I'll start with Brian C. if you're
So,
ready.
yeah, sorry, I do have to go back into some notes because it's been a while, and I need to make sure I'm saying this all right. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest things was right off the bat, like what was once a one tractor fire was automatically going to become a two tractor fire because you're going to have access issues and you have to keep each other safe. So there was definitely, from a response to wildfire standpoint, if you get a call in the primary area, you got two tractors automatically going. That is not the case anymore. Thankfully, we were able to back off from that. But another thing that still exists to this day that kind of came out of that was the pre-positioning of resources. When you know that you've got heavy fuels and you see the conditions kind of going downhill as far as weather and, fuel moistures, things like that, being able to have like a strike team or task force put in place around the right part of the state or the right part of your region, having aviation resources available. I know we had some seat contracts, and I think in conjunction with the U.S. Forest Service for a few years, so that we had quick access to small planes that could drop water real fast if we needed them. And just really when it came to the wildfire standpoint, once you started to get into big wildfires, because there were a few larger wildfires as a result of this, you really got to emphasize the safety and not taking any unnecessary risks, because at the end of the day, if you just have a swamp burning and there's no value at risk, no risk to human health at that point in time, maybe don't go into that swamp or get super close to that swamp. And that's some of the experience that I had on the Bertha swamp fire over in our Chipola district, where I guess I was kind of going to this real quick here. We had a fire that broke out in 2022 in March and late February, early March, and it blew up very quickly. And there was a huge problem containing that fire. Our firefighters, try as they might, kept getting themselves stuck all over the place. And what was kind of unique about that site was it was managed land. The uplands were managed private lands, one of the larger private landowners in Florida, and it was being managed by a management company. And they had done their best, right? It was 2022, is quite a few years after Michael came through. They did their best to clean things up, but where they weren't going to spend money and time was in swamps, because they have pine production land and they want to plant trees and grow trees. And there was some very, I don't want to call it questionable, because I don't know what the motives were or what the financial situation is or was, but like the way that vegetation was cleared, you've got swamps that are just jackpots of timber that are just twisted up in every which way in there. But then as they cleared the uplands and replanted, in some cases, some heavy debris was left adjacent to the rows that was planted, leaving additional heavy fuel on the ground. Now, granted, it wasn't a whole lot of flashy fuels around it, but there were some and enough. And what happened with this fire is the sea breeze starts kind of kicking about March 1st every year, pushing north from the Gulf. And that was artificially fueling that fire, or wasn't artificial, it was fueling that fire in a push to the north. And the reason I bring all this up is because we got to a point, I'll never forget the phone call I got from one of the supervisors out on the fire. The sound of his voice, just the despair of like, what can we do differently? I was working as the F-band on that fire. We were about a day away from that fire starting to impact additional communities to the north. And they, despite all the efforts, were really having a hard time containing it. Most of that was had to do with the swamp, Bertha swamp. Every time they would try to do anything with the swamp, they would get stuck, and they were having to daisy chain dozers together to try to get them out of the swamp. Heavies weren't super effective either. And it was almost like a complete pullback situation. The only reason that fire did not cause more damage, especially to homes or humans, was because we had a rain event that happened mercifully on, I think it was the Wednesday of that week, and it dropped about 3 inches in a day, and then it rained about 1 or 2 inches more the next day. And that was able, fortunately, to essentially extinguish that fire was enough to send the team home. But had that rain not come, we might have been talking about a completely different outcome to that fire because of how bad the swamp was. So we think about the uplands, we think about all this other stuff that needs access, but you have a place that's just spewing fire and is just almost I don't want to say an unlimited source of fuel, but a very rich source of fuel. And then chained together, multiple swamps. I mean, it can get dangerous quick. So there was a lot of briefing, a lot of safety that went around that. Just don't take unnecessary risks, because it wouldn't be easy to go in and get somebody if they were, get a dozer hung up too far into a swamp.
Yep. No, appreciate you sharing that. I sent a few Fish and Wildlife Service folks from Tyndall up to help with that and heard some pretty harrowing stories. So, Brian R., how are y'all thinking about this from a risk management point of view, of a risk to responders type of point of view of how do you keep your people safe, but also effectively suppress fires? And you have,
Yep.
yeah,
One of the big concerns that we're having is, still being able to meet that golden hour to get firefighters out of the woods if something was to happen. So it's taking additional planning, and staging resources, line medics, local EMTs, in more locations, just so we can continue to meet that golden hour, to try to get folks out of the woods. One of the problems we're also running into is historically we've used the black as our safety zone. Either going direct or bringing the fire with us. Now with the amount of storm debris, even if it's not contributing to fire intensity, you just can't access the black to get firefighters in there. Just due to the amount of debris on the ground. So even fires that are moderately low intensity, you just can't, you don't have that access to be able to get people in to use that as a safety zone. So we're having to get out ahead, and scout, look for those sheltered coves that may have not received the storm damage, and make sure that our escape routes are going to get us there into those, more sheltered areas that are, that could be used as that traditional black safety zone that's not, full of blowdown. So we're, also having to use aviation a lot more, for either for scouting to determine, the amount of storm damage in the area. We're using storm damage maps to look at those storm damage layers and field maps to, try to, with some areas that are completely devastated, it's pretty easy to see, but it's those pockets, those small patches that you just can't get through, identifying those early before you get crews committed. Like I said, using maps to identify those storm damage areas, but also using aviation. We use type 1 ships a lot more in the spring than we have historically. And, that's definitely something we're going to have to factor in more as we're dealing more with the storm damage, is having that water carrying capacity, to be able to get it into the areas to buy us the time to back up and find, what's our best option going to be. So it's continuing to evolve. We're learning as we go, and kind of having to adjust with each fire that we're on.
makes sense. And while I got you, I'm seeing a lot of comments, or there was a little bit of a thread on biochar and kind of going back to what do you do with all this material? I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I know there was a lot of talk about biochar, but I, I don't know if at scale it's feasible, and I didn't know if you had thoughts on that, Brian R., if you've seen much of that in Western North Carolina yet, or if it's moved, if that market is there, that sort of thing.
I have not been involved with any of the biochar projects. I know there's some research and experimenting going on, but I'm very just kind of hear about it, but I have not been involved with it any.
I don't know, Steve, Norman, if you've heard anything either. Just thought I'd.
Yeah, I mean, the Southern Research Station has a research project supposed to lean to address that very thing. Matt Callahan made a comment on that for that end. in the chat. The fundamental problem is we have a problem now, and it's still very local, very small scale. A big need is to bring the material to the burner, and in mountainous areas it can be difficult. By our heavy development and fragmentation. When you have a lot of parcels, we have a lot of forest owners. Half of them in some places are non-resident forest owners. And the problem really isn't just on your parcel, it's on your neighborhood parcel when it comes to doing wildfire behavior. So there's a lot of challenges to actually have this work at scale, as was pointed out. It's a solution, and it certainly should be pursued. But what's on the table is how much of a solution it can be, given the scope of the problem. And what
it's all reactive locally to trying to find that, build the market, get the technology in place, get the transportation of material, all that. But it's like you had to wait till the storm hit to start that whole thought process. So I feel like long term it could be a viable market. Kind of moving it back to Jeff and a little bit of ecology of fuels again. We touched on this some, Jeff, but are there in coastal plains, southern pine, certain silvicultural strategies that you would recommend to kind of build resilience in the you talked, I guess you kind of spoke to that previously. I guess maybe you've seen on the flip side a challenge to the restoration from hurricanes, or have you seen, I guess you got on Itchaway there. I don't know if were you impacted by Michael there on Itchaway? You mute.
Yeah, I wasn't here at that time. I came a few, maybe a year, right? Actually, exactly a year after, to look at the impacts. We lost one out of every 6 trees, so we had, and about 20% of the basal area. So we had a pretty intense hit. I mean, in terms of resilience, I don't know. One study that we looked at was on climate adaptation, and we have a scientist here named Josh Pulick and a previous scientist named Seth Bigelow lead this adaptive silviculture project where they're trying different climate adaptive strategies to see how can you conduct silviculture in these new climate regimes. And one of the challenges that we found in this study is that these kind of adaptive silviculture treatments were implemented where they're really focused on how do we deal with the incoming drought. And so they came up with a couple of different treatment options, one of which promoted longleaf pine as well as some drought-tolerant oaks, southern red oak being one of the primary ones. And so drought was really the focus of resilience, but what we found is that after the hurricanes weren't really a big part of that consideration of the adaptive strategy. It's something that comes to all of our minds immediately now, but was not really front of mind until it happened. And so what we found is that emphasis on the xeric oaks actually came to bid us when the hurricane came, because those red oak in particular is one that we found to be particularly sensitive to hurricane winds. And so if you're trying to manage for drought resistance, but instead you end up dealing with losing it to hurricanes. So it's difficult to kind of balance all of these, and so it's probably smart to consider all of the whole world of different climate adaptations that you might need to encounter, not just the ones that come to mind right away. Hurricanes are one that you don't think a lot about until they impact you, but one of the things we're finding in our research is there's a lot of attention brought to areas that get really intense storms, but outside of the eye wall of the hurricanes are really large areas. You called Michael a relatively small and tight hurricane, and you're right, but it's still the width of Georgia, and it impacted almost the entire state. And so there are lower severity winds that impact all the time, and we found that tropical storm level winds impact much of the coastal plain about every 6 years on average. So we think about a 2-year return interval for fire over much of the coastal plain, but with tropical storm winds, it's about 6 years. So this is Even if you don't see the immediate intense impacts, this is something that's happening in the background all the time.
Appreciate that. And kind of bookend it with the Southern Apps. Steve, Norman, have you found that certain species were more resilient to winds than others, or pretty much the winds overcame all of them equally?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think ultimately we're going to have better insights from that from our FIA legitimate sampling system. But the anecdotal evidence we see from all sorts of people, especially in areas closer here to Asheville, is the white pine was just incredibly sensitive to the storm. And you see a lot because there is a lot. So is it more likely to fail? And kind of hard to really say.
Yeah.
Red oak are very vulnerable. We lost a lot of very large trees. Quite often the larger trees, especially if they're oak trees, they had a lot of leaf retention that allowed them to fail. Tulip poplar is a little more stable. And so there's plenty of them that fell on these large blowdown tracts. And the smaller tracts, I don't think we saw so much. They lose their leaves early. Their phenology is a little bit early. So those leaves weren't creating the drag, and that probably contributed part of it, as well as characteristics of the wood. Most of our trees were uprooted. They were not snapped on the bowl. And that's because it was just profoundly wet in the 2 days,
Yeah.
2 days before. More rain fell over much of the area in the day before the storm and fell with rain, but we had more than enough during to cause the landslides and to saturate the soil, make the tree unstable. So, to some degree, the tree roots might have been able to make a difference. One interesting aspect, just to build on what was discussed a little bit before, the intersection of wind and fire is really interesting because in some places where we had a lot of burning, you can see scars from that wildfire burning, repeated fire in places like Linville Gorge, but possibly also even in our prescribed fire units, we do scar trees. Fire does that. And you see a lot of snapped trees that had scars in those areas because of Helene. And so when you think about all this debris, it's going to be there a while, and it's going to cause a lot of scarring, basal scarring of the surviving tree. Really hard to prevent that. But progressive consumption that keeps the heat intensity lower, but still, it doesn't take much when you have so much debris. We're right next to a bowl of a tree that you want to have some scars form, and so. Somehow we have to manage this intersection of wind and fire. We're going to have wind like this moving forward, and we're going to have fire. We might have a younger cohort of trees in our future. It's hard to negotiate how those two are going to work together. There's a lot we don't know about that intersection.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing here too, Brett?
Go ahead, Jeff.
One thing that slipped my mind to talk about earlier on preparedness and increasing resilience proactively is just doing relatively intense burns to begin with. And I should caveat this and say that it's a study that's currently being conducted by a master's student. We haven't published it just yet, so results may vary if you try it. But we looked at a long history of prescribed fire here in longleaf pine at Itchway, where we have pretty good records of large areas that either consistently or occasionally got pretty intense crown scorch, canopy scorch. And then we actually checked to see how those fared after Hurricane Michael and found that the areas that were consistently received pretty high amounts of scorch actually fared much better. And so we suspect one thing that's going on is that more intense, maybe summer burns and things like that can create canopy scorch and limb up the trees to reduce the tree crown size. There could also be an indirect effect where the smaller crowns have less photosynthetic capacity, so you get a little bit of reduced growth, and then more intense or more dense wood, things like that. So that's a little bit preliminary, but just a pretty interesting anecdote I thought on that wind and fire interaction and how you could manage for a decade and help increase hurricane resistance in that way.
It makes me feel so much better about all those hot burns I lit off throughout my career. Um, Steve, I wanted to jump back to you real quick. You've been working on some various tools, remote sensing, but mapping. I don't know. I wanted to give you a minute to kind of talk about some of the tools you're developing at Southern Research Station for specifically Helene, I think in this case, but that could be relevant and useful to managers potentially.
Yeah, we don't have tools that are specific to fire or hurricanes. It's a generic tool we developed to understand where impacts are, and um, it uses 10-meter Sentinel-2 satellite data just to look at change. And we do it for all disturbances across the Eastern United States. The project is called HIFORM, HIFORM. And quite often the need that we're trying to address is very, very soon after the storm. And to do that at scale, these large scale hurricane events, sometimes you just need to rely on satellite data. NOAA comes out and flies areas near the coast really quick. In just a few days, they're flying under the clouds quite often, in between the clouds. And you can see urban effects pretty quick. There are commercial satellites that are pretty high resolution that are daily that can be very impactful. But it's a little bit challenging to put this into broader context over scale. And seeing damage isn't enough. You want to understand how it's changed. So we look at change over time, and we have products available. You can go to the highform.org website and navigate the land and the Southern Apps a case study to look at, well, the Hurricane Helene case study to see our preliminary maps. We follow up subsequently, and those follow-up maps aren't up there. But those products are available for anyone as we're uploading on that site after a big event.
I appreciate that. And to kind of add on, I've been working with Steve on this since Helene, but Steve's change detection product, Wildfire, is now using that for their last update. It's actually the 2024 update because they're always a year behind, but to the extreme and very high damage, I think, from that HiForm product to update the disturbance layers and fuel models within Wildfire, and that'll help, I hope, planning into the future for RX, for wildfire model or fire behavior modeling, all of that. They tried to release it back in September, had some issues, or there were some gaps in the data, so they're now working on updating it. But as soon as that's ready and updated, you should be able to see the footprint of Helene in Wildfire, which is a big victory. I feel like wish I could do that for every storm, and they do change detection, but I think they went above and beyond on this one. We're running close on time. We got about, I think, 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna look through this real quick, see what else. Planning tools. Let's talk smoke and air quality for a second. So Steve Norman, what are the major concerns for you, or kind of how do you see, yeah, what are the major concerns with smoke post Helene and kind of over time, how do you see that changing potentially?
Yeah, so I've been doing a tremendous amount of thought to this. I think it's an important thing to start with is we have a lot of our landscape up here that has not seen fire in maybe 100 years, 80 years. And so there's a tremendous amount of duff on even the dry fire adapted forest type on those slopes. And most of even without Helene, we had tremendous smoke problems in the fall of 2016. And it's mostly because of that accumulated fuel. Most of our landscape does not see prescribed fire, it doesn't see wildfire today. And a lot of those places are private land, and that's where a lot of the blowdown happens.
Mm.
And so the fuel that's there, all the large wood in particular, once it becomes available, is going to be able to create a lot of smoke in conjunction with all that accumulated melting fuel from 20th century or 21st century that we've just not been able to get a hold of.
And
So
Brian
that
Rod,
all the communities, it increases evacuations. It's a broad scale event. And I think from a response perspective, it's interesting to think about how smoldering wood that's there for a long time could make it harder to get that fire out in a 2016 style event where individual fires run for weeks and weeks and weeks. We had an extended drought period. Fires started, they get bigger and bigger, and they're slowly put out and replaced by other ones. And that's the sort of pattern that's typical. You see it 100 years ago, you see it in 2016 and 17, and we're going to have that again for sure. And if the fire is going to last longer, it's going to be harder to put out because all these stumps, these root masses, and logs are burning. How does that effectiveness to really suppress fires within an outbreak scenario?
and I know it was really early on last spring when the outbreaks were occurring in the southern Apps. Brian, do you remember if smoke was more of an issue? I know stuff was still fresh, maybe not as available, but do you remember a ramped up kind of either public information campaign or air quality campaign or more issues around smoke this past spring than normal or about normal?
This past spring, we didn't have, necessarily the issues with, increased smoke. Like I said, the heavies dead and down weren't really contributing yet, but we also just the atmosphere we had. We had those multiple red flag warning days where we had that high wind, real good smoke dispersion. So the smoke was getting up and out. It wasn't hanging around, laying in those low lying areas as much, but that is going to be, really important going forward. Once we start getting that, more smoldering in the heavies, increased signage on roads just to make sure that, we're labeling that, notifying folks of that low visibility, working with our cooperators with DOT, to just to make sure that we're keeping those roads safe because like I said, it's going to happen with those heavy fuels once they start, really smoking, smoldering, and especially nighttime, early morning hours. So having that social media campaign to notify, the public, it's going to be, more frequent going forward and might be every fire, but also to really paying attention to those heavy fuel moistures for planning prescribed burns, to try to limit that inconvenience, I guess, to the public, making sure that we're not giving ourselves a black eye while we're trying to conduct the prescribed burns if we're, smoking out major communities. So it's going to be a monitoring, making sure that we have realistic fuel moistures and, to know when those heavies are kind of reaching that point that they're going to cause air quality problems.
If folks aren't used to thinking about fuel moisture in terms of yeah, they're not out measure or drying weighing fuels. I know you have a resource in North Carolina, the Fire Weather Intelligence Portal. I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit and whether that has some useful fuel moisture
Yep.
information.
The North Carolina Forest Service, we've, been working with, a lot of different agencies to have a series of RAW stations across the state and then also, across the southeast that show up on our website through the Fire Danger Intelligence Portal. And you can get a lot of good information. Your fuel moistures, your KBDI, days since rain. There's a ton of information that you can kind of sort through and query on the intelligence portal, and to have that idea of, it's not site specific, but it will give you a good idea of, what your fuel conditions are looking like across the state of North Carolina as well as the Southeast, since those other states are included as well.
Yeah, that's an amazing tool. I use it all the time, and I love if you go into like the RAWS station, individual RAWS station, you can look at trends in fuel moisture. So if you don't know if what the thresholds are, 15% for 100-hour, 20% your threshold, you can at least say, hey, we're kind of similar to normal, or we're going down or up. You can kind of see where you are that way. That really, I like that a lot. Um,
Yep, and after the lean, we're trying to identify some more areas that have coverage holes and get some additional raw stations. One of the areas that's being looked at is the South Mountain Range, since it's pretty unique and there's quite a bit of storm damage. So looking at the South Mountain Range and some of those higher Tennessee border counties that were affected. So we're hoping to get some additional raw stations plugged in and kind of cover some of these holes and kind of paint a better picture for people that are doing burn-in or for wildfire suppression on what their fuels are looking like.
yeah. Yeah, and in general, I remember at Tyndall, everything just took a lot more planning when it came to burning, especially burning. As far as smoke management, burns that we didn't have to put up the lighted road signs, the DOT road signs previously. Every burn, all of a sudden, we were doing DOT road signs. We were talking to all our partners, meeting with Florida Forest Service. Anyway, it took about twice as much planning for a burn in heavy damaged fuels, and a lot of that was smoke. Also, all the snags and oh, broken limbs and all that, both control concern and more mop up, but also we got a ton more calls because it looks like Roman candles from the roadside if you're burning up against the road. So just wanted to any other thoughts on smoke before we kind of wrap up here? Uh, did want to end on a positive note. I know hurricanes for a lot of people. Well, I've been through a number of them, been personally affected. They can be traumatic. It can be a long-term trauma or a lasting trauma, but and it can make forest management challenging, difficult. But I wanted to give Jeff Cannon a second to, if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, kind of what you found from your research is positive ecological or positive effects of hurricanes ecologically. Um,
Yeah, thanks. I mentioned a couple of them, but yeah, like I said, a lot of us who are here to figure out how to manage with the disaster. But yeah, I just want to emphasize what an important part these are to many of our ecosystems. And we've been starting to look at various mechanisms of ways that hurricanes can, might be critical. And I focus most of this on longleaf pine. And so one, I mentioned how much wildlife uses those tip-up mounds. One other kind of interesting thing we found is that it looks like hurricanes might actually stimulate reproduction in longleaf pine, and that's interesting because they are a masting species that reproduce very irregularly and synchronously. So it might be once every 7 years or so, but it might sort of synchronize across a region. And there hasn't been a good explanation for why that happens, but we did see it was pretty well connected to hurricanes in the years following a hurricane. You get this 2 year bump in reproduction. We think it's because of the rain, the 10 centimeters or so on average of rain, much more for Helene, obviously, but the rain that comes at sort of an odd and otherwise dry time of year seems to play a role. And another neat thing that we found, and this part is in progress, but we're starting to look at different pine species and ask the question, could they be actually hurricane adapted? And so we're kind of following the footsteps of fire researchers who are looking at bark and sprouts and leaf traits and all these different evolutionary adaptations to fire and seeing if trees might have similar ones for hurricanes, which would be from roots and crown architecture and things like that. So yeah, those are just a couple of the interesting things that we've been looking at how hurricanes might be critical to some of the ecosystem.
well, hey, we've reached the end of the time. I feel like I could sit and talk to y'all for hours on this, and really appreciate all of you making the time to do this today. I hand it back to you, Lindsay, for closeout.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, thank you, Jeff and Brian C. and Brian R. and Steve. I know I learned a lot. I thought that was a really great discussion. Um, and I just want to thank you for allowing all of us into your space and to bear witness to your expertise, and to see and hear your personal experiences and how you're navigating the challenges of these big disturbances. So thank you all. And lastly, before we close out this discussion, there will be a survey pop up on your screen as the discussion closes. If you could just take the time to complete that survey, it is anonymous, and we do look at the results of that survey. Again, our next and last fueling collaboration of the season will be on February 19th, and we hope to see you all there. Thanks, everybody.